My name is Bethany. I'm 38 years old. And for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind on the surface. Easygoing, low maintenance, not materialistic, the strong one. I live just outside Manchester, in a quiet, semi-detached house with a small garden I've slowly brought back to life. Professionally, I work in compliance for a mid-sized financial firm which, if you know anything about that world, means I notice details other people overlook. I read what's written in the margins. I pay attention to what isn't said. But in my family, I was never the one people worried about. I was the capable daughter, the one who didn't need help, the one who would understand, the one who would be fine. And when you're the one who's fine, people start assuming you don't require fairness. This story isn't about a dramatic betrayal. No one screamed at me across a dinner table. No wills were ripped apart in a lawyer's office. There were no cinematic storms or slammed doors. It was quieter than that. It's about inheritance, yes, but not in the way you think. It's about what happens when you ask a simple, reasonable question, and the people who claim to love you immediately label you greedy, not because you asked for more, but because you asked it all. For years, I played the role that kept the peace. I rationalized small slights. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. I believed that loyalty meant silence. Until one day, I realized something uncomfortable. Silence protects the system that benefits from it. What unfolded after that wasn't revenge. It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. This is a story about documentation, about patience, about understanding leverage before you ever speak. It's about how people react when the easy daughter quietly stops absorbing the cost of everyone else's comfort. And it's about what fairness actually looks like when you refuse to perform gratitude for crumbs. If you've ever been the one in your family who's expected to cope without complaint, if you've ever been told you were better than that simply because you wanted clarity, then you may understand the weight of what I'm about to share. I wasn't asking for more, just what was already mine. Have you ever noticed how quickly people question your character when you finally question theirs? In my family, I was the stable one. That wasn't a compliment. It was an assignment. My older brother, Daniel, was brilliant but sensitive. My younger sister, Chloe, was creative and free-spirited. My mother described herself as emotionally exhausted. And my father, before he passed, was simply the provider. And me, I was the reliable one. The one who would sort things out, the one who didn't need fuss, the one who wouldn't make things complicated. From a young age, I learned that competence is often punished with expectation. If you handle something well once, you're handed it forever. When Dad's health started declining, I was the one who researched care options. I compared policies, I organized medical files into labeled folders, I attended appointments with a pen poised, writing down terminology that the rest of them found too uncomfortable to hear. Daniel would sit quietly, then later say, "I just can't deal with all this admin stuff." Chloe would squeeze my hand and whisper, "I'm so glad you're good at this." Good at this? As if it were a hobby. When bills needed sorting, I handled them. When the paperwork arrived, it came to me. When Mum cried about how overwhelmed she felt, I made tea and reassured her that everything was under control. No one ever asked if I felt overwhelmed. They assumed I wasn't. At family gatherings, I was the listener, the mediator, the one who smoothed over awkward silences and redirected tense conversations. If Daniel snapped at someone, it was because he was stressed. If Chloe forgot a responsibility, it was because she was overwhelmed. If I said nothing, it was because that's just who Bethany is. I wasn't invisible in a dramatic way. No one ignored my birthday. No one excluded me from photos. It was subtler than that. My presence was functional, useful, predictable. And predictability makes people comfortable. When Dad passed, there were tears. Of course. Shock. Even though we'd been preparing for months, the funeral arrangements were mostly handled by me, not because anyone formally asked, but because I started making calls, and no one objected. Afterward, people praised my composure. "I don't know how you stay so strong," Mum said at least 3 times that week. I didn't feel strong. I felt efficient. There's a difference. In the months that followed, conversations about the future floated in and out of family dinners, vague references to the house, Mum's finances. One day, when the time comes, Daniel once joked, "Well, We all know Beth won't need anything anyway. She's the sensible one. Everyone laughed. I smiled. Because that's what I did. But something about that sentence lodged itself quietly inside me. Won't need anything anyway. It wasn't malicious. That's what makes these things so dangerous. It was casual, unexamined, spoken as if it were obvious. As if my financial stability somehow cancelled my position as a daughter. As if fairness were negotiable based on personality. The unspoken narrative became clearer over time. Daniel might struggle, Chloe might need support, Mum deserved security. And me, I would understand. I always did. The truth is, I never demanded recognition for the emotional labor, the administrative work, the quiet, stabilizing force I'd been for years. I told myself that love isn't transactional, that families aren't balance sheets, but fairness isn't greed, and silence isn't a virtue. At that stage, though, I hadn't fully articulated that to myself. I only knew that when inheritance was vaguely discussed, there was an invisible asterisk next to my name. Bethany flexible. Bethany fine without it. Bethany won't make this difficult. They didn't see me as weak. They saw me as absorbent. And absorbent people are expected to soak up whatever would otherwise spill onto the floor. It would take me a while to realize that just because I could carry the weight didn't mean it was mine to carry alone. The first real cut didn't come during a formal discussion. It came over roast chicken on a Sunday afternoon. Mum had started mentioning getting things in order, not in a dramatic way. Just a few comments about how the paperwork needed updating, how she didn't want us arguing one day. I offered to help. Of course I did. We sat at her dining table with a stack of documents, insurance policies, pension statements, and the mortgage summary on the house. Daniel drifted in and out of the room. Chloe stayed for 20 minutes before announcing she had a headache. It ended up being just Mum and me. As I reviewed the documents, I noticed something that made me pause, not alarmed, just attentive. A recent transfer from one savings account into another joint account I hadn't seen before. Is this new? I asked gently. Mum hesitated for half a second. Barely noticeable, but I noticed those things. Oh, that's just something Daniel suggested. She said, to make things simpler. Simpler. For who? I asked, still calm. For me, she replied quickly. And for him, really. He's been helping me with some things. Helping? I nodded. I didn't accuse. I didn't imply wrongdoing. I simply made a mental note. Later that afternoon, when Daniel returned to the table, I asked in what I believed was a neutral tone. Should we all sit down together at some point to go over Mum's estate plans, just so everything's clear? The room shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, but it shifted. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Why planning something? He laughed when he said it, but not fully. Chloe, from the sofa, chimed in. God, Beth, you're so intense sometimes. Mum sighed. Can we not turn this into something unpleasant? Unpleasant. I blinked. I'm not turning it into anything, I said evenly. I just think clarity avoids misunderstandings later. Daniel's smile thinned. We're not even at that stage. Mum's alive and well. I know, I replied. That's why it's easier to talk about now. There it was again, that subtle tightening in the air, as if I had stepped into a room I wasn't supposed to enter. Mum reached for my hand. Sweetheart, you don't need to worry about all that. You've always been so independent. This is more about making sure Daniel and Chloe are secure. Secure? The word landed heavier than it should have. And I'm not, I asked softly. She looked genuinely confused. Well, you are. That's what I mean. You've done so well for yourself. It was framed as praise, but it felt like exclusion. Daniel shook his head slightly. This feels a bit grabby. Beth, not like you. Grabby? That was the word. Not greedy, not yet, but close enough to taste. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I let the moment pass. I even apologized lightly if I'd made things uncomfortable. That's the part I replayed later. I apologized for asking for transparency. That evening, back in my own kitchen, I opened my navy leather notebook, the one I use for work notes, and wrote down the date. Not because I thought something criminal was happening, but because something important had just been revealed. Not about money, about perception. The narrative had already been written. Daniel needed protection, Chloe needed support, Mum needed peace. And I needed nothing, except, apparently, to stop asking questions. It was the first time I realized that in my family, my competence didn't earn me an equal footing. It disqualified me from it. After that Sunday, nothing dramatic happened. No one called to argue, no one sent defensive messages. In fact, everything felt almost aggressively normal, which is how subtle dynamics survive. At the next family dinner, Daniel brought wine and made a show of being cheerful. Chloe talked about a new creative project. Mum asked me about work and told me she was proud of how steady I always was. It would have been easy to convince myself I'd imagined the tension, but I hadn't imagined Daniel's tone when he said, "grabby." I hadn't imagined the quick alignment between all three of them, as if I'd stepped outside a role I was meant to stay inside. And then the small adjustments began. When financial matters came up, they no longer happened around me. I noticed because I wasn't invited to notice. Daniel started helping Mum with online banking. Chloe mentioned that Daniel had sorted something out with the house insurance. Mum casually referenced conversations I hadn't been part of. Each time, it was presented as efficiency. "You're so busy, Beth. We didn't want to burden you." Burden. It was almost generous the way they excluded me. At first, I rationalized it. Maybe Daniel genuinely wanted to step up. Maybe Mum wanted to feel supported by her son. Maybe Chloe just didn't think about these things deeply. I told myself I was overanalyzing. After all, nothing had actually happened. No one had said I would be excluded from anything. There was no official decision, just a gradual repositioning. And I complied with it. Not outwardly, I didn't agree to be sidelined, but I didn't challenge it either. I allowed the conversations to drift without me. I stopped asking follow-up questions, because every time I had, the emotional cost was disproportionate. A raised eyebrow, a sigh, that subtle suggestion that I was being a bit much. It's strange how quickly you can be trained to associate your own clarity with conflict. One evening, Chloe called me. We were talking about something unrelated when she said, almost casually, "I think you scared Mum a bit the other week." Scared her, I asked. With all the inheritance talk, it felt very transactional. There it was, a step closer. Transactional. I asked for transparency. I said, "I know," she replied. "But it sounded like you were worried about getting your share." My share? The phrase hung in the air like something distasteful. "I wasn't worried," I said carefully. "I was asking to understand." Chloe hesitated. "You've always been the least fussed about money. It just didn't feel like you." Translation. Stay consistent with the version of yourself that makes us comfortable. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Your identity has already been assigned. Deviation will be interpreted as moral decline. And so I did what I'd always done. I adjusted. I stopped initiating conversations about estate planning. I redirected my attention back to my own life. I visited Mum, brought groceries, fixed her Wi-Fi router, and listened to her worries. Outwardly, I remained the dependable daughter. But internally, something was changing. Not anger, awareness. I began observing without engaging, listening without volunteering, noticing patterns instead of reacting to them. I saw how quickly Daniel's suggestions were accepted without question, how Chloe's emotional reactions softened any critique, how Mum's desire to avoid discomfort overrode practical discussion, and I saw how my composure, the thing they praised, was being used as justification to exclude me from consideration. I wasn't being attacked. I was being repositioned. Gently, politely, incrementally. Until one day, I realized I had been moved from participant to assumption. Bethany will be fine. Bethany doesn't need. Bethany won't challenge. And for a while, I let that narrative stand. Because it was easier, until it wasn't. There's a moment when you stop reacting emotionally and start recognizing structure. For me, that moment came quietly, not during an argument, but during observation. It was late autumn. Mum had invited us all over to go through a few practical things. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I usually did. Daniel's car was already in the driveway. Inside, papers were spread across the dining table. They paused when I walked in. It was subtle, just a flicker of body language. Daniel shifted a folder closed. Mum smiled too quickly. "Oh, good, you're here," she said. "We were just chatting." Chatting. I sat down. No one handed me the documents. No one explained what had been discussed. Chloe arrived last, breathless and apologetic. Mum immediately began summarizing everything for her, carefully, patiently. I noticed the difference. When Chloe didn't understand a term, Daniel explained it gently. When Mum seemed unsure, Daniel reassured her. When I asked one clarifying question about percentages, the air tightened again. It's all standard, Daniel said. Nothing to overcomplicate. Overcomplicate. There it was again, that subtle framing. Chloe looked at me. You don't think Mum would do anything unfair, do you? It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was moral positioning. The implication wasn't that I'd said something wrong. It was that my very question hinted at distrust. And in our family, distrust was treated as disloyalty. That evening, driving home, I finally named it. My role wasn't accidental. It was convenient. Daniel was the emotional son, his needs visible and urgent. Chloe was the sensitive daughter, her fragility protective. Mum was the matriarch deserving of comfort above all. And me, I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to. Reliable, useful, invisible, not unloved, just strategically undervalued. There's a difference, because when you're valued for what you provide rather than what you're entitled to, your contributions become currency, not proof of equality. I began replaying years of small dynamics. How often had I been told, "You'll understand"? How often had fairness been framed as unnecessary in my case because I was doing well? How often had my silence been interpreted as agreement? The realization wasn't explosive, it was clinical. I wasn't being excluded because I was disliked. I was being excluded because I was predictable. They knew I wouldn't cause a scene. They knew I wouldn't threaten the emotional equilibrium of the family. And so the practical decisions could be adjusted quietly, justified by need, by vulnerability, by who would struggle more. The role assigned to me was simple. Be grateful for not needing. It sounds noble on the surface. It's not, because not needing isn't the same as not deserving. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my navy leather notebook open in front of me. I didn't write accusations. I wrote observations, dates, comments, financial shifts I'd noticed, phrases used repeatedly. Not because I planned to fight, but because I finally understood something essential. When people rely on your predictability, the most disruptive thing you can do isn't shout. It's a change in pattern. I hadn't decided what that meant yet. But for the first time, I stopped trying to be the version of myself that made them comfortable and started asking, quietly, what would it look like if I stopped absorbing the imbalance? The shift didn't happen at a family dinner. It didn't happen during a tense conversation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a solicitor's waiting room that smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. I hadn't told anyone I was going. That's important. I told myself it was just curiosity, professional habit. In my line of work, clarity is preventative, not provocative. If something feels structurally off, you don't accuse, you verify. So I booked a consultation under the quiet pretense of general estate planning advice. The solicitor, a woman in her late 50s with steady eyes and no unnecessary warmth, asked simple questions. How many siblings? Is there property involved? Has a will been updated recently? I answered factually. When I explained the dynamic carefully, neutrally, she didn't react emotionally. She didn't validate or dismiss. She simply asked, "Are you named as executor?" I paused. I assumed we would be joint, I said. Assumptions, she replied gently, are not legal structures. Something in me settled at that sentence. Assumptions are not legal structures. For years, I had been operating on emotional contracts, on implied fairness, on the belief that love automatically produces equity. But systems don't function on implication. They function on documentation. I didn't accuse my family of anything in that room. I didn't even say I suspected wrongdoing. I simply asked what questions a person in my position should be asking. The solicitor outlined possibilities. It was entirely legal, she explained, for a parent to adjust asset distribution based on perceived need. It was also common for one child, usually the responsible one, to handle administration without necessarily benefiting equally. She said it without judgment, as if it were a pattern she'd seen many times before. I felt something unexpected then. Not anger, not betrayal, clarity. The discomfort I'd been feeling wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. When I left that office, nothing externally had changed. No confrontation had occurred, no dramatic revelation had surfaced. But internally, the ground shifted. I stopped framing this as a potential misunderstanding and started seeing it as a structure already in motion. That evening, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and watched the light fade. I didn't cry, I didn't draft a message, I didn't rehearse speeches. I reviewed options. Option 1, continue trusting that everything would balance itself out emotionally. Option 2, ask directly for confirmation and risk being labeled dramatic, greedy, distrustful. Option 3, quietly prepare. That was the first time I chose stillness strategically rather than emotionally. I realized something important. If fairness was already assumed unnecessary in my case, then asking repeatedly would only reinforce their narrative about me. But preparing required no permission. That was the shift. I stopped trying to be seen as good and started trying to be informed. It wasn't about money at that point. It was about refusing to participate in a system built on my silence. For the first time, I understood that quiet doesn't have to mean passive. It can mean controlled. And once you see the structure clearly, you can decide where and whether to stand inside it. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. And steady is far more dangerous than emotional. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a way to smooth tension, a way to maintain peace. I stayed quiet because speaking cost too much emotionally. Now, I stayed quiet because it revealed more. There's a difference. At the next family dinner, I didn't bring up finances. I didn't ask about documents. I didn't clarify percentages or ownership structures. I listened. Daniel spoke confidently about long-term planning. Mum nodded in agreement at things I knew she didn't fully understand. Chloe contributed emotionally. As long as we're all fair, that's what matters. Fair. The word had become symbolic rather than specific. I noticed something else, too. Without my questions, Daniel filled the space easily. He explained decisions as if consensus had already been reached. He used phrases like, "we decided and it makes sense." No one stopped him from defining who we included, and I didn't correct him, because correction would have centered the narrative around my discomfort. Observations centered on truth. I began documenting patterns more carefully, not obsessively clinically. Dates when joint accounts were mentioned, times when Daniel described himself as handling something, comments from Mum that suggested reliance. It wasn't about building a case against them. It was about building clarity for myself. Silence has a way of unsettling people when it no longer serves them. After a few weeks, Chloe asked me casually, "You've been really chill about everything lately. Are you over the inheritance thing?" Over as if it had been a phase. I wasn't upset. I replied evenly, I just wanted transparency. She studied me for a moment. "Well, you seem fine now." Fine. That word again. I smiled. The truth was, I was calmer than I'd been in months, because I had stopped trying to change their perception of me and started adjusting my position within the structure. Mum called one evening, sounding slightly uncertain. "Daniel says we should probably update the will soon," she said. "But there's no rush." "No rush," I echoed. "We just want to make sure it's straightforward." "Of course," I said. "Clarity is always easier earlier." There was a pause. "You trust us, don't you?" she asked softly. That question used to destabilize me. It didn't anymore. "I trust documentation," I replied gently. "It protects everyone." She didn't argue, but she didn't volunteer details either. And that told me enough. Silence became information. The more I withdrew from emotional engagement, the more the structure revealed itself. Daniel's confidence grew in proportion to my quiet. Chloe's reassurances became more performative. Mum's desire to avoid discomfort remained consistent. They mistook my restraint for surrender. They mistook my calm for compliance. They mistook my lack of confrontation for a lack of awareness. That miscalculation would matter later. But at this stage, I wasn't planning a move. I was studying the board. There's something powerful about no longer needing to be understood. When you release that need, you stop negotiating from emotion. You start negotiating from a position, and the position requires patience. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be the emotional stabilizer. I was becoming something else. Not aggressive, not cold. Precise. And precision, unlike reaction, doesn't require volume. It requires timing. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. That's why no one noticed mine. I didn't hire investigators. I didn't confront banks. I didn't demand copies of documents I wasn't entitled to see. I simply educated myself. In compliance, we're trained to map systems not emotionally, but structurally. Who has authority? Who has access? where risk accumulates, where documentation overrides assumption. So I treated my family situation the same way. First, I reviewed what I already knew: public records, property ownership filings, the mortgage history on Mum's house. It was still solely in her name, which was important. No quiet transfers had occurred. Then I looked at financial vulnerability patterns. If Daniel was increasingly helping Mum with banking, what authority had she granted him? Power of attorney, joint account access, informal password sharing. I couldn't see inside her accounts, nor did I attempt to, but I could observe behavioral shifts. Daniel began referring to the house as "when we sort it out eventually." He spoke about future renovations with unusual familiarity. He once said, almost absent-mindedly, "It just makes sense for continuity." Continuity! That word lingered. Meanwhile, Chloe floated above logistics as always. She would say things like, "I don't care about money, I just want us to stay close." It sounded virtuous, but virtue without specifics often benefits the person least likely to be excluded. And me, I started restructuring my own position. Not emotionally, financially. I reviewed my savings, investments, and property plans. I met with a financial advisor, framing it as long-term security planning. I ensured my own affairs were airtight. Because here was the uncomfortable truth I had to face. If I was already being framed as the one who didn't need, then I needed to remove any dependency narrative entirely. Not to prove anything, but to neutralize leverage. I also did something else. I stopped providing administrative help. Subtly, when Mum asked if I could quickly look over a pension document, I said, "Daniel seems to be handling those now, he's probably more up to date." When Chloe asked me to check a contract related to her freelance work, I gently suggested she consult a professional. It wasn't withdrawal, it was a redistribution. I wanted to see what happened when I stopped stabilizing. At first, nothing obvious changed. But gradually, small cracks appeared. Mum began calling Daniel more frequently, sometimes sounding flustered. Chloe mentioned that Daniel was a bit stressed lately, once, during dinner. Daniel snapped slightly at Mum about a login issue. The system was recalibrating without my invisible labor, and here's what fascinated me most. No one connected that recalibration to me stepping back. They didn't see the structural shift. They only felt mild friction. Meanwhile, I documented, not obsessively, but carefully, dates of conversations, mentions of will updates, shifts in language around ownership, even emotional cues, defensiveness, avoidance, over-reassurance. I wasn't building a case against them. I was building immunity for myself. There's a difference between suspicion and preparation. Suspicion is emotional. Preparation is quiet. One evening, Mum mentioned casually, "We might formalize some things soon, just so Daniel isn't left scrambling if something happens." Left scrambling. The phrasing was revealing. I asked gently, "Will that include all of us?" She hesitated. "Well, it depends on what you mean." I didn't press, because pressing forces clarity prematurely. Instead, I said, "Whatever you decide, I just hope it's documented clearly. It protects everyone." I watched her process that. Protection had always been my role. Now I was redefining what it meant. Behind the scenes, I also requested something simple but significant: a copy of Dad's original will. As his daughter, I was entitled to see it. I framed it as personal closure, wanting to understand his intentions. Mum seemed surprised but didn't refuse. Daniel looked irritated. That reaction told me more than the document itself. When the copy arrived, I read it slowly. Dad had divided everything equally. No caveats about need. No language about flexibility. Equal. I closed the document and sat very still. Because what they were gradually shaping wasn't tradition. It was a reinterpretation. And reinterpretation thrives when one person remains quiet. They never noticed that I had stopped being quiet internally. They never noticed that I was no longer operating on trust alone. They never noticed that I was preparing for a future conversation, one that wouldn't be emotional, one that would be precise. The leverage didn't arrive like a revelation. It emerged like a pattern, finally completing itself. It started with a small administrative detail, the kind most people would overlook. Mum mentioned, in passing, that she and Daniel had an appointment scheduled with her solicitor to simplify things. She said it lightly, stirring sugar into her tea, as if the conversation were about repainting the hallway. I didn't react. "When is that?" I asked. "Next Thursday." "Ah," I said, "good to stay organized." She studied my face briefly, almost searching for resistance. There wasn't any. That was intentional. After she left that afternoon, I made a quiet phone call. Not to confront, not to accuse, to confirm. I contacted the same solicitor's office I had visited weeks earlier. Not to discuss Mum's appointment, confidentiality wouldn't allow that, but to inquire about something procedural. What typically changes, I asked neutrally, when one adult child becomes significantly involved in estate planning logistics. The solicitor paused before answering. It depends on the parent's wishes, she said carefully. But often it includes adjustments to executor roles, sometimes distribution percentages, particularly if one child is perceived as more available. Available. That word landed cleanly. Is it common, I continued, for parents to shift assets during their lifetime in ways that affect final distribution? Yes, she replied. Lifetime transfers can alter the estate's balance considerably. Alter the estate's balance? That was the moment. Not dramatic, not shocking, but clarifying. If assets were gradually being repositioned under the umbrella of simplification and support, the final will could appear equal on paper while the substance had already shifted. Continuity, security, available. The language suddenly aligned. I didn't panic. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt steady. Because the uncertainty was gone. This wasn't about being disliked. It was about narrative justification. Daniel had positioned himself as the present, hands-on son. Mum found comfort in that. Chloe floated above details, trusting emotional harmony, and I had allowed myself to be reframed as independent enough not to require structural protection. The leverage wasn't explosive evidence. It was understanding. Understanding that by the time formal documents were shown to me, the meaningful shifts might already be complete. Understanding that transparency, once delayed long enough, becomes technically optional. That night, I opened Dad's original will again. Equal distribution. Clear language. No ambiguity. I placed it beside my notebook and stared at both. One was a legal fact. The other was lived pattern. And they were no longer aligned. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was nothing satisfying about it. But clarity is powerful precisely because it removes fantasy. For weeks, I had wondered whether I was overinterpreting small social cues. I wasn't. The system was adjusting politely, gradually, legally, without ever needing to call me greedy, because labeling me greedy had been a preemptive defense. It reframed my request for clarity as moral failure. And once that narrative is established, any further questions can be dismissed as character flaws. I wasn't angry at Daniel. In his mind, he was stepping up. I wasn't angry at Mum. In her mind, she was ensuring security. I wasn't even angry at Chloe. She lived in a world where fairness was emotional, not structural. But I could no longer afford to live there. The private reveal wasn't that they were villains. It was that they were human. And humans protect perceived vulnerability first. Competence doesn't register as vulnerability. It registers as capacity. And capacity gets redistributed. I closed the notebook and made a quiet decision. Not about confrontation, about trajectory. If the estate was being restructured around proximity and perceived need, then my response would not be emotional persuasion. It would be structural repositioning. Because once you understand the architecture of a system, you stop trying to win arguments inside it. You decide whether to alter your place within it or step outside it entirely. And I was very close to choosing. Once you see the structure clearly, you lose the comfort of pretending. That was the hardest part. For a few days after that phone call, I moved through my routines as usual. Work, gym, grocery shopping, Sunday visits. But internally, I was evaluating. Not emotionally, strategically. There were, realistically, 3 paths in front of me. The first was confrontation. I could sit Mum down and say plainly, I know adjustments are being made. I want full transparency. Now. I could reference Dad's original will. I could demand clarity on percentages, executorship, and lifetime transfers. It would force everything into the open. It would also confirm the narrative they were already preparing, that I had become fixated on inheritance. The second path was passive trust. Do nothing. Assume that love would override an imbalance. Accept that even if distributions shifted, I would be fine. That was the version of myself they expected. The absorbent one. The third path was the quiet one. No accusations, no dramatic ultimatums. Just a clear boundary enforced not through argument, but through consequence. I spent an evening listing what I actually wanted. Not money, Not victory, not validation. I wanted two things: transparency and dignity. If transparency was being withheld, then I could no longer continue performing the role that made that withholding comfortable. I realized something uncomfortable. My continued emotional and administrative support strengthened the very system that sidelined me. I was stabilizing a structure that was quietly recalibrating without me. So the decision wasn't about forcing inclusion. It was about withdrawing the subsidy. The next Sunday, when Mum mentioned the upcoming solicitor meeting again, I said something different. Will I be included in that discussion? I asked calmly. Mum hesitated. It's really just procedural. I understand, I replied. But if my position in the estate is being discussed or altered in any way, I'd prefer to be present. Daniel looked at me steadily. It's Mum's decision. Beth, I agree, I said. And my decision is whether I continue participating in logistical support without clarity. The room went quiet. No shouting, no accusations. Just a line drawn gently. Chloe frowned. That sounds transactional again. It's structural, I corrected softly. There's a difference. Mum's voice wavered slightly. Are you saying you'll step back? Yes, I said. From administrative involvement, not from you, but from decision-making I'm not allowed to see. Daniel's jaw tightened. So this is leverage now? No, I replied, it's alignment. I wasn't threatening legal action. I wasn't contesting anything. I was simply stating that I would no longer contribute invisible labor to a process I was excluded from. That was the irreversible choice. Because once you stop stabilizing a dynamic, it reveals its true weight. Mum looked genuinely unsettled. I never meant for you to feel outside, she said quietly. I don't feel outside. I answered, I feel unconsulted. That distinction mattered. Daniel didn't respond. But something shifted. Not resolution. Recognition. For the first time, my calm wasn't interpreted as compliance. It was interpreted as a boundary. And boundaries, unlike questions, can't be reframed as greed so easily. I left that evening without drama, but I knew the trajectory had changed. Because I had stopped negotiating for inclusion and started adjusting my presence. Quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. After that Sunday, I didn't wait for reactions. I moved. Quietly. The first change was logistical. I drafted a simple email to Mum, calm, respectful, precise. I reiterated what I had said verbally, that I would no longer manage documents, review financial paperwork, or provide administrative oversight unless I was formally included in discussions regarding the estate. I made it clear this wasn't emotional withdrawal. It was structural alignment. No accusations, no references to greed. Just clarity. I also requested, in writing, confirmation of whether any lifetime transfers or changes to executorship had been made or were being considered. That detail mattered. Written communication removes ambiguity. Daniel responded first, not Mum. His email was short. Everything is above board. You're overcomplicating something that doesn't need to be complicated. I read it twice. Then I replied with one sentence. Transparency simplifies, it doesn't complicate. No escalation. No defensiveness. Then I did something else. I formally removed myself as an informal guarantor. Years earlier, when Mum refinanced a small loan tied to home improvements, I had provided supporting financial documentation to strengthen her application. It hadn't been a legal guarantee, but my income profile had been referenced in affordability assessments. I contacted the lender to confirm my current position, and I clarified politely that I would no longer be participating in any financial representations moving forward. No one noticed immediately. That was the point. I also redirected something subtler access. Mum had long stored important documents in a shared cloud folder I initially helped organize. I removed my editing permissions and informed her she could transfer full control to Daniel. Since he was handling logistics, again, no drama, just consistency. Meanwhile, I met with my own solicitor again, not to contest anything, to prepare. We discussed what would happen if significant lifetime gifts altered the estate disproportionately. We discussed my rights if transparency was denied. We discussed contestation thresholds not as threats, but as knowledge. Knowledge removes intimidation. At work, I continued as usual. At family dinners, I remained composed. I asked Mum about her health. I brought dessert. I hugged Chloe. I nodded when Daniel described sorting things. Externally, nothing looked different. Internally, I was no longer positioned as a silent pillar. I had shifted from an informal participant to a documented stakeholder. And documentation changes tone. A week after the solicitor appointment I hadn't been invited to, Mum called. Her voice was strained. There were some updates, she said carefully, such as I asked. Daniel will be the sole executor now. It's just simpler. Simpler. And distribution, I asked evenly. It's still fair, she said quickly. Fair, not equal. Fair. I didn't argue. I'd appreciate a copy once it's finalized. I said, for clarity. There was a pause. Do you not trust us? She asked again. Softer this time. I trust clarity, I replied. That sentence had become my anchor. Because trust without documentation is sentiment. And sentiment bends under pressure. Daniel began responding to me differently after that. Less casually, more guarded. He realized something subtle but important. I wasn't fighting emotionally. I was positioned legally, and positioning doesn't create noise. It creates gravity. No one outside our family knew anything had shifted. There were no explosive confrontations, no dramatic ultimatums, just small, quiet realignments. But those realignments removed something they hadn't realized I'd been providing for years. Stability without condition. And when stability becomes conditional, even calmly, the system begins to feel unfamiliar, uncertain, vulnerable. They just didn't know it yet. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as friction. Small at first. Mum called me less about paperwork because I had stepped back. Instead, she began calling Daniel more frequently. I know this because he mentioned it one evening. Irritation just beneath his tone. She rings 3 times a day about minor things now, he said, swirling wine in his glass, passwords, statements. It's constant. I nodded sympathetically. It can be a lot. There was a flicker in his eyes, something between accusation and realization. He had wanted control. Control comes with maintenance. Chloe started noticing tension too. Daniel seemed stressed. She told me over coffee, I thought you two were sharing the load. We're not, I said calmly. He's the executor now. It makes sense that he handles it. She blinked. Oh, right. It hadn't occurred to her that executor meant responsibility, not just authority. Meanwhile, Mum's tone shifted subtly when she spoke to me. There was a new caution in it, as if she were choosing words carefully, as if she sensed that something structural had changed, even if she couldn't fully name it. One afternoon, she asked almost hesitantly, You're not distancing yourself, are you? No. I said, I'm just aligning my involvement with my inclusion. She didn't argue. But she didn't like the sentence either. Alignment has edges. The first tangible crack appeared a month later. Daniel mentioned that Mum was considering transferring a small investment account into his name for ease. For ease, he repeated, as if rehearsed. I looked at him steadily. Is that reflected in the will adjustments, I asked? He frowned. Why does everything have to be formal with you? Because informality creates confusion later, I replied. He exhaled sharply. You really think I'd cheat you? There it was. The moral pivot. I think documentation protects everyone, I said evenly. He didn't respond, but something in him tightened. Because here was the uncomfortable reality. If everything were genuinely equitable, transparency would cost nothing. Resistance only appears when clarity threatens advantage. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't need to. My calm had become a mirror, and mirrors are unsettling when someone prefers narrative. At home, I continued strengthening my own independence. I increased contributions to my investments. I accelerated a small renovation plan I'd been delaying. I finalized my own will, evenly distributed, explicitly structured. Not performatively, principally. Weeks passed. Then Mum called one evening, voice fragile. Daniel says this is becoming stressful. She said, he feels like you don't trust him. I listened. I'm not asking him to feel trusted, I said gently. I'm asking for clarity. Silence lingered on the line. You've changed, she said finally. Yes, I agreed. That was the first time I admitted it openly, because I had. Not into someone harsher, into someone less absorbent. The consequences weren't explosive. They were psychological. Daniel began to feel scrutinized. Chloe began to feel uneasy. Mum began to feel tension she couldn't soothe with reassurance alone. And none of it was because I had shouted. It was because I had stopped subsidizing comfort with my silence. The system was recalibrating again. Only this time, it wasn't adjusting to my predictability. It was reacting to my boundary. And boundaries, once visible, force everyone else to reassess their position, even if they'd rather not. By the time they realized the shift was permanent, it was already too late to restore the old dynamic. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because trust, once recalibrated, doesn't return to its original shape. The solicitor's finalized documents arrived a few weeks later. Mum forwarded me a scanned copy. There it was in clean legal language. Daniel sole executor. Specific assets allocated during lifetime transfers. The remaining estate was divided in a way described as fair and proportionate to need. Not equal, proportionate to need. I read every line slowly. There were no illegal maneuvers, no forged signatures, no hidden clauses. Everything was lawful, carefully structured, strategically justified, and unmistakably different from Dad's original intentions. When I closed the document, I didn't feel shocked. I felt confirmation. That evening, Daniel called me. "You've seen it, I assume?" "Yes," I said. "It's fair," he insisted quickly, "given circumstances." "Fair and equal aren't synonyms," I replied. There was a pause. "You don't need the same support," he said, more bluntly this time. "You're established. Chloe's inconsistent. Mum worries." I let the sentence hang. "So stability is being reinterpreted as forfeiture?" I asked quietly. "That's not what I'm saying." "It is," I said calmly, "just not intentionally." He exhaled sharply. "You're making this into something ugly." "No," I said. "I'm refusing to pretend it's something else." The conversation ended without resolution. "Not explosive, just final." Mum called 2 days later, voice trembling. "I thought this would make things easier," she said. "Now everything feels tense." I didn't comfort her the way I used to. Not coldly, but honestly. "Ease for one person often transfers pressure to another," I said. "It doesn't remove it." She began to cry softly. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I replied. "Intent and impact aren't always aligned." That sentence changed the tone completely, because it wasn't accusatory. It was factual. Over the following weeks, the emotional atmosphere shifted. Daniel became defensive more quickly. Chloe tried to mediate, saying things like, "Can't we just move on?" Mum oscillated between reassurance and guilt, but something fundamental had already locked into place. I no longer participated in future planning discussions. I attended family dinners, but financial topics drifted around me awkwardly. The assumption that I would quietly adapt had evaporated, and with it, a kind of comfort they hadn't realized depended on my compliance. "One evening," Chloe said softly, "it just feels like we've lost something." "We've lost an assumption," I corrected. She didn't understand immediately. That was okay. What they were mourning wasn't family unity. It was the version of me that made unevenness invisible. And that version was not returning. Not out of spite, out of principle. Because once you see the structure clearly, once you've read the documents, understood the logic, traced the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And you cannot unknow your own worth. The window for restoring informal balance had passed. Everything was documented now. Defined, fixed. And while they could regret the tension, they couldn't reverse the decisions without acknowledging what those decisions implied, which they weren't prepared to do. So the new reality settled in, quieter than conflict, heavier than before, irreversible. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no dramatic gathering, no raised voices, no ultimatums. It happened on a grey Saturday afternoon at Mum's kitchen table, the same table where I had once asked, gently, for transparency and been labelled grabby. This time, no one used that word. Daniel had requested we clear the air. Chloe sat between us, anxious but hopeful. Mum looked smaller than usual, hands folded tightly in front of her. Daniel spoke first. "This can't keep hovering like this," he said. "We're family. We shouldn't feel like we're in negotiations." I met his eyes. "We are in negotiations," I said calmly. "You just finalized them." Chloe flinched slightly at the word finalized. Daniel exhaled. "It's Mum's estate." "Yes, I agreed. And you're executor. That's documented." The word documented shifted something in the room. It removed emotion and replaced it with fact. Mum's voice trembled. "I didn't want you to feel punished for doing well." "I don't feel punished," I replied. "I feel redefined." Silence followed that. Daniel leaned forward. "You're acting as if we betrayed you." "No," I said evenly. "I'm acting as I've adjusted." He frowned. "Adjusted how?" I no longer assume equity where documentation says otherwise. Chloe spoke softly, but we're still siblings. Yes, I said, and I love you both. But love and estate structure are separate categories. That was the part they struggled with. In their minds, asking for equality had been emotional, personal, almost accusatory. In my mind, it was structural. Daniel's tone sharpened slightly. You're financially secure. Why does this matter so much? There it was. The core justification. It matters, I replied calmly, because precedent matters. They looked confused. If stability becomes the reason someone receives less, I continued, then stability becomes disincentivized. That logic doesn't disappear just because we're related. Mum blinked, absorbing it slowly. I thought you would understand, she whispered. I do understand, I said gently. I just don't agree. There was no anger in my voice, no heat, just clarity. Daniel rubbed his temples. So what do you want now? To contest it? To fight? No, I said, I want alignment. Alignment with what Chloe asked. With reality, I replied. You've made decisions based on perceived need. I've made decisions based on documented position. That's fair. Mum's eyes filled with tears again. I never wanted this to divide you. It hasn't, I said softly. It's revealed differences that were already there. The conversation didn't end in resolution. There was no dramatic reconciliation. But something important happened. They stopped trying to frame me as greedy, because greed is loud. And I wasn't loud. I was measured. There's no villain in a calm room. Only perspectives. When I left that afternoon, Daniel didn't hug me immediately. Chloe did. Tightly. Mum held my hands a little longer than usual. No one apologized. No one reversed anything. But for the first time, they understood. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was operating deliberately. And that difference changes the power dynamic completely. I used to think strength meant absorbing impact without changing shape. I don't think that anymore. Strength, I've learned, is choosing when to change shape deliberately. It's been over a year since that kitchen table conversation. The estate structure remains as documented. Daniel manages the logistics. Chloe remains emotionally attached to the details. Mum avoids the topic unless necessary. And me, I am no longer the invisible stabilizer. Not because I withdrew love, because I withdrew the assumption. The most surprising outcome wasn't financial, it was relational recalibration. Daniel treats me differently now, more cautiously, more respectfully. He no longer jokes about me not needing anything. He consults me occasionally, not because he must, but because he understands I won't participate without clarity. Chloe has matured in quiet ways. She's begun asking more specific questions about her own contracts and finances. Once, she even said, I think I used to confuse harmony with fairness. That sentence meant more than any apology. Mum still struggles sometimes. She wishes things felt lighter, but she no longer asks whether I trust her. She knows the answer. I trust documentation. And I trust myself. The biggest change, though, isn't in them. It's in me. I no longer interpret being self-sufficient as a reason to accept less. I no longer equate silence with virtue. I no longer soften my questions to protect other people's comfort at the expense of my clarity. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer need them to see me as good. That used to be my quiet addiction. Being the reliable one, the undemanding one, the daughter who understood. Now, I'm something else. Balanced. Not emotionally reactive. Not resentful. Just aligned. I built my financial future independently of whatever may or may not come from the estate. I expanded my investments. I completed the renovation I'd been postponing. I structured my own will clearly and equally. Not as a statement, as a standard. I still attend family dinners. I still bring dessert. I still listen when Mum talks about her garden. But when conversations drift toward assumptions, I gently redirect them. When language becomes vague, I ask for specifics. When fairness is framed as emotional, I define it structurally. And something remarkable happens when you operate like that consistently. People stop labeling you greedy, because greed demands more. Clarity demands definition, and the definition is difficult to argue against. I am not colder. I am not harder. I am simply less absorbent. And that has changed everything. If you had asked me 2 years ago what this story was about, I might have said money, inheritance, fairness, family tension. But that's not what it's really about. It's about the quiet expectations placed on the capable one It's about how competence can be mistaken for consent, how independence can be reframed as immunity, how being fine can slowly turn into being overlooked. I was never asking for more than anyone else. I was asking not to be redefined without my knowledge. When my family called me greedy, even subtly, it wasn't because I demanded excess. It was because I disrupted a narrative that benefited from my silence. And here's what I've learned. You can love people deeply and still refuse the role they assign you. You can remain calm and still be immovable. You can decline to fight and still change the outcome. Quiet dominance isn't about winning, it's about alignment. It's about understanding that fairness doesn't become petty simply because you articulate it, and that asking for clarity doesn't make you disloyal. Sometimes the most powerful shift isn't confronting others. It's deciding you will no longer subsidize the imbalance with your stability. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't scream across a dinner table. I adjusted my participation. And when you adjust participation, the entire system has to rebalance. That's the part no one warns you about. If you've ever been the one who doesn't need, the one who will understand, the one who's expected to cope quietly, I hope this story reminds you of something simple. Stability is not forfeiture, silence is not agreement, and fairness is not greed. I wasn't asking for more, just what was already mine. Now I'm curious. If you were in my position, would you have confronted them sooner or chosen the same quiet path I did? Tell me in the comments.